losing that game and what ended up happening, and but don't want to harp too much on it because at the end of the day, this team far exceeded expectations from what I think a lot of fans had. I think that many fans thought Sweet 16 was their ceiling, especially due to the fact that they had not found the defense for large portions of the season. And, I think that a lot of fans would have been happy if this team got to a Sweet 16, lost to North Carolina, and you would have been happy with the result. But they made a Final Four and did something that many thought just wasn't possible. I did a write up on Substack talking about what the Final Four kind of meant to me and the reason I ended up going to, again, I talked about the reason I went to LA was for that, to see if we could be there. And Alabama made it, right? Alabama made the Final Four. And, you want to win the games, you want to win a national championship, and that's where you want to set your sights now. That's where Nate Oates, that's where the rest of the team has set their sights now. But making a Final Four is a massive, massive accomplishment and, does not need to be taken lightly. That banner is going to hang in Coleman forever. That trophy, for winning the West region is going to be there forever, right? So that is something to cherish and to embrace no matter what. So the UConn game, Alabama ends up losing that game. I have the stats here in front of me. They end up losing that game by 14. It's 86-72. Alabama honestly did a really good job in the game. Alabama was shooting really well in the first half. They were at 70% from three. But if you had watched much of Alabama or much of UConn this season, it kind of felt like the inevitable. It kind of felt like even though Alabama was playing some of its best basketball, they had only had 5 turnovers in the first half. They were 70% from three in the first half. And were playing pretty well. It still kind of just felt like UConn was going to find a way to win the game. Because Alabama was going to probably shoot a little worse from three because 70% on a full game is not super realistic. They might have a couple of turnovers, but even if they didn't, UConn was just playing super sound basketball. And every time there was a tiny mistake from Alabama, whether it be, we took too long to take a three, an extra dribble, or there was a turnover or a steal, or we got our shot blocked, or a missed rotation. No matter what it was, any small mistake that some teams are unable to capitalize on, UConn absolutely capitalized every time, right? When you're talking about defending and the defense, part of the reason why UConn was so good in this game was UConn just capitalized and made Alabama defend for 30 seconds every possession, right? Ryland talked after the game, they asked, why is it so hard to defend UConn? And he's like, they have counters to your counters, and their sets do this. And, most teams we play may have a set for 2 or 3 guys. They had a set for every guy on the court, right? At the end of the day, Dan Hurley's offense is very methodical and, did a really good job of making our defense stressed out, and it stressed the defense. And the shots that Alabama was making were keeping us in the game, but it just wasn't enough. It was kind of too little too late almost. But that's okay, right? UConn goes on to beat Purdue to back-to-back win the national title the last 2 years, and the 14-point loss to Alabama that actually was much more like a 6 to 8 point game with 2.5 minutes to go. But, rises to 14 when Alabama tries to get some steals at the end of the game, was actually the closest game that UConn had in this entire tournament, right? Alabama did a very good job against UConn in comparison to what the rest of the field did, right? So losing to the team that's the eventual national champion is nothing to shake your head about, right? Dan Hurley coached an incredible bunch, and that bunch is going to go up there with some of the best to ever do it in terms of national championship teams. They go 36-3 on the season, right? They had just 3 losses and finish on an awesome winning streak. UConn, I mentioned Alabama ended up, only having 5 turnovers in the first half, shooting 70% from 3. They end the game shooting 47.8% from 3, right? Above our season average and absolutely good enough to win the game. But they only got off 11 threes. Alabama made 7 in the first half and only got off 11 total. Only made 11 total in the rest of the game. They were 7 for 10 in the first half, so they got off just 13 more. in the second half, going 11 for 23. 23 attempts isn't quite what Nate Oates wants. That was largely in part due to the fact that UConn was there on the catch, and UConn made sure in the second half to run Alabama off the line. The misses in the second half were not ideal, but again, we were going to miss some shots. If you tell me we're shooting 47.8% from three against UConn, I'm going to take it all day, every day. That is a really good shooting percentage, and whether they all happened right away or not, that percentage is fine. I have no problem with that. Alabama ended up with just 8 turnovers. If you've watched Alabama for pretty often, 8 turnovers is pretty low, right? A lot of that might have to do with the fact that this was a slower tempo game. There was only 63 possessions in this game. Again, a lot of that had to do with UConn's methodical offense. But 8 turnovers for Alabama basketball is very few, right? This team typically averages somewhere in the 10 to 12 range. Under 10 turnovers, again, I would have absolutely taken if you offered that to me coming into this game. Alabama has 15 fouls versus UConn has 17. Cool, right? All of these stats, if you offer them up to me, I'm absolutely going to take them, right? Alabama played a good game against UConn. UConn scored a 1.37 points per possession. Absolutely phenomenal, right? UConn's offensive sets and UConn's game plan worked to absolute perfection. In the first half, Alabama was making Stephon Castle shoot the three, similar to how they did against Trimble and Kudo from North Carolina. Castle made a couple of threes. He ends up going 2 for 6 from three, so the threes he made in the first half, were what they were. UConn shot 40% from three themselves, right? UConn got 8 blocks, right? That was a part that we thought might happen, and it did. Donovan Clingan had 4 blocks to his credit. But, at the end of the day, Alabama had 5 blocks. This was a fairly clean game from both sides. There were some fouls that were a little confusing to me, right? Mark Sears gets called for a foul on a hand check for fighting through a screen, but then the very next the possession just before, Mark Sears was being held in the same way, didn't get called for it, right? I thought that the ability for an Oates technical was very high in this game. Part of that to do with Pat Adams being on the ref sheet, but part of that just doing the way that this game was called. I thought that there was a decent chance that Nate was going to get a technical. He did not. I think he just knew that the points were way too important, and getting a technical at this point in the game and this point in the season was not something you could have. I thought that Grant Nelson played an awesome game. Grant Nelson goes 19 points, 15 rebounds, and had an absolute awesome tomahawk on Clingan, right? There were moments of this game where Alabama looked completely the part, right? UConn gets out to an 8-point lead in the second half. Alabama fights back to tie it. UConn immediately goes on an 8-0 run, right? It felt like every time Alabama gave the counterpunch, UConn was there to jump right back on it, right? There was no real runs in this game that UConn got on. Looking here at the breakdown, there was no run by either team that was over 8 points, right? So there were some runs. Don't get me wrong. Basketball is a game of runs. But Alabama kept away the kill shot. They kept away that under 10-point run, or over 10-point run, I should say. So, if you give me these things going into the game, hey, there's not going to be a kill shot run. Alabama's going to have just 8 turnovers. They're going to shoot 47% from three. They're going to have less fouls. They're going to get a 1.14 points per possession against a really good defense. Probably would have taken it, right? UConn's just that good. UConn took advantage of every mistake, every missed swap, every anything, and made us pay for it, and they won the game, right? Again, this was about I believe this was an 8-point game or a 7-point game when Mark Sears hit a 3 with about 2.5 minutes to go. They ended up hitting a couple of threes late in the game when Alabama was going for steals and trying to create turnovers to see if they could lengthen the game. They ended up losing by 14. 14 was not what this game was. This game, again, was somewhere around an 8-point, 10-point game. For the majority of the game, neither team had led by more than 8 prior to the very end of this game. So just a heads up, But nevertheless, Alabama played the eventual national champion to that point, and what they did was they proved that Nate Oates' offense is capable of making this type of run in the tournament, and our offense is not what lost us this game. I won't even say our defense lost us the game. I think UConn was just the better team. But if you're going to point at one of the two things as to why you lost, you're definitely going to point at the defense that gave up the 1.37. You're not going to point at the offense that scored that scored a 1.14 and had about 48% from three. You're not going to point at that, right? You're definitely going to point at the defense if you were to point at one of the two things for this, right? So that's the big thing, right? Be proud of this team. Be proud of what they were able to accomplish. And know that this team will forever be known as the team that made Alabama's first ever Final Four. I do not think this will be Nate Oates' last Final Four. I think this is just the first. As Nick Saban says, this is just the beginning. I would fully expect this team to be back, whether it be this year or in the near future. I think this coming year's team has a great chance. But, that's just something that I think that you should keep in mind.